The background of the book, I'm not quite certain why I wrote my master's thesis on the alienation of parklands, except that as an officer of the Department of Recreation and Sport, my interests are in recreation planning and also in the use of open space. Must have been some of those sort of factors. I was indeed fortunate in having Hugh Stretton as my supervisor. He not only stretched and stimulated my thinking on the subject, he also suggested that the history shouldn't be just a history, but also contain some practical observations of present-day usage of the parkland. And I describe in the book the occasions when, with my wife and dog, went to the parklands on a number of occasions just to observe the people who actually do use the parklands, and wrote that into the history. Also, he suggested, that is, Hugh Stretton suggested, that we should look at some of the suggestions for future management of the parklands. And this takes it somewhat out of the traditional historical thesis type of project. All the time I was doing the research over a number of years, I was amazed that no one else had done any work in this area. It's still a mystery to me that while there are histories of the Botanic Garden and the zoo and of the art gallery and of the university, there has been no work done in the parkland's historical sense. And I suggest that if any budding historians are amongst us, that's a fertile ground for future work, particularly in the area of the role of the Adelaide City Council as the key manager and planner of the Adelaide Parklands. That is, the Council's 150 Jubilee comes up in 1992. Maybe they ought to be thinking of some sort of history of the Adelaide Parklands as part of their 150 Jubilee. Hugh Stretton continued to be interested in the possibility, after the thesis had finished and I'd perhaps lost a little bit of my fervour on the parklands, Hugh encouraged me to think of this as a book, and I pursued this. Many of you will have had the depressing experience of trying to find a publisher. It looked like this may be possible, first of all, through Wakefield Press, in my case, as a Jubilee 150 effort, but this was not to be, and at one stage, 2 years ago, the government printer got interested with it, maybe because of the Premier's interest, but again, it didn't come to anything. I got so mad at this stage about the vague promises of things to be done on this area that I went ahead and published under Bland House, on the basis that the book would be a loss and that there would need to be additional booklets produced that might recoup that loss. And there will be coming out in April, free plug, a book on walks in the Adelaide Parklands, and another one mid-year on jogging or running in the Adelaide Parklands, and a third one on cycling in the Adelaide Parklands. I think that people who are interested in those three areas would be keen to see walks and runs and cycling in the Adelaide Parklands. I hope so, anyhow. Three other factors, though, suggested that I should go ahead with the book. One was there's a growing interest in the parklands, certainly with the Adelaide Review of the Adelaide Parklands. The City Council appointed consultants to determine the objectives and future management plan for the parklands. This was the first time that they'd sat down and really done some work in this area. And I'm happy to say that the Adelaide Plan has some very firm objectives on the future development of the Adelaide Parklands. The government also, and the second factor was that the government established the Tompkinson Review to advise on how government reserves in the parklands could be returned to public use. These are things like the Hackney Bus Depot, the Adelaide Jail, the Post-Telly building in West Terrace, the ENWS Depot at Theberton, and the police barracks at Theberton. And this is the first time the government have actually looked at handing back sections of the parklands that have been alienated since virtually early last century. And the third factor was that it's just a few months ago, virtually, that the Adelaide Parklands Preservation Association was formed, and this body has, I think, brought together enthusiastic people who are keen to fight for the retention of the parkland itself. So there is an interest, and the one interest is, of course, that Sir Walter Crocker is patron of both that organisation and this society. Well, the structure of the book. Having decided to proceed with the book itself, the structure of the book was of fundamental consideration. It meant a complete rewrite of the thesis and a thorough edit of the text by an independent person. I naively thought that you could switch a thesis to a book, but was sadly disillusioned. It virtually meant a complete rewrite. Let me be quite clear, though. It's not a narrative history, but unashamedly a history with a specific purpose of tracing the methods by which the parklands have been alienated since they were planned by Colonel Light in 1836. So you just can't pick it up and run through it as a narrative history, but you need to look at each section of the parklands, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Now, the first slide deals with the traditional photo, or map, if you like, of the parklands, and it's Colonel Light's map. You may not be able to pick things up, but let me just try and take you through some of them. It's rather interesting. If you've got a picture of the parklands as they are now, the Botanic Garden was supposed to be there in Colonel Light's day. Of course, it ended up down in this area. Then you have a storehouse, which is fairly immaterial, and the school, which was going to be in North Adelaide. The storehouse was there, but of course we know the school ended up down here in West Parklands. The government domain, of course, is where it is now, but as I'll point out later, King William Street ended there, and there wasn't a road through in Colonel Light's original plan. The guardhouse here on North Terrace was part of the barracks and the destitute asylum, which is now, of course, a museum of social history, or 2 or 3 museums of social history behind this building. Then you had the hospital over here. I'm interested in the arguments that are now raging about the Adelaide Hospital and the nurses' parking, and the assumption that they can pinch some parking area for in Frome Road, but the hospital itself was on East Terrace. So the argument they are mounting that the hospital was part of Light's original plan is correct, but the location of it is somewhat out, so that the hospital didn't end up as Light wanted it there. In fact, Charles Kingston moved it. The cemetery stays as it is, and Immigration Square, which is wrong. Immigration Square number 9 here is virtually where the Adelaide High School is, was really a marketplace in Light's original plan. It was only after, a few years after Light had originally planned this, that it became Immigration Square, where the people who were coming out to the colony were dumped virtually in shocking conditions, tin sheds and hovels almost. And I think they deliberately kept that way so that they moved out very quickly out of the parkland. So that sort of became Immigration Square, but in Light's original plan, that was in fact a market square, never ended up being that. Now, the total area of that was 2,300 acres, around about 930 or 980 hectares. I'm not very good at hectares. And the actual areas for government reserves was something like 280 or about 177 hectares. Now, if you can picture that and keep it in your mind, we'll go and look at, a little bit later on, some of the a map of Adelaide as it is now, and you can see how many other areas of the parklands have been alienated over time. And that was the basis of my work, was to trace and plot each piece of land that has been alienated from this base map and build up a picture of how and why the decisions were made to let Light's original parklands go. And some of them are quite intriguing, the unbelievable reasons, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, why the parklands were alienated. Now, let's have a look at the parklands in 1840s, 1850s and 1860s. This is a slide of the Government House, or just near Government House, taken from about where the Elder Rotunda is, over near the Festival Theatre. And it's taken looking back toward Government House. You can see it sort of tucked away in that corner there a little. And it's painted by Colonel Light, a man of many talents. He was not only a planner, he was a soldier, and he was a painter as well. The next slide is of Government House on North Terrace. You can see it is somewhat similar today, the structure, and I suspect that over a period of time it's just sort of grown and bits added on, but basically it's there still. Probably taken or painted in the 1840s by S.T. Gill. I think the gardens are somewhat a little different nowadays. They are what I'd call primitive parklands, and not the manicured gardens that we have at Government House now. The next slide is North Terrace looking west. You'll note on the right is the old Legislative Council building. This is it here, the Constitutional Museum, if you're not up to the latest term. And that building is surrounded by parklands. You can see the parklands around them. I wonder what Light would think nowadays if he returned and saw that area. And can you notice on the left-hand side of the North Terrace, if you like, Trinity Church? There's the tower of Trinity Church there as well. Now the next slide is North Terrace, not looking west, but looking east. And you'll note that the guardhouse over there, where those nice little soldiers are standing, is at the entrance to Government House. Look at the children playing and the dogs. That's in fact what North Terrace looked like. It was just bull dust during the summer and mud during the winter. In fact, the public baths were established about 15 years later so that men could wash the dust off themselves at lunchtime so they could go back to work. That was Adelaide in that particular period of time. The next slide shows King William Street looking north. You'll note that, as I said on the original plan, King William Road didn't go through. It stopped at North Terrace, and this was one of the highlights of Light's thinking, that the avenue, if you like, down King William Street should finish and focus on government domain. You'll notice the flagstaff just there, government flagstaff, if you like, near Government House. Now, it wasn't until about 1854, anyhow, that the road went through, certainly a long time after Light. The next slide shows the parklands, if you like, where the Agricultural and Horticultural Society grounds were. Now, this is the corner, if you like, of Frome Road and North Terrace, where the SAIT Brookman building is. Again, this was painted by Light, so I guess it would have been around about 1846. And in fact, the Agricultural and Horticultural Society had a number of locations in the parklands until they moved to Wavell. Now,
excuse me, did you say painted by Light in 1846?
no, sorry, S.T. Gill. I'm sorry about that, S.T. Gill. No, Light only painted the one that I showed first. The next slide shows the Brookman building, if you like, as it is now. That's the SAIT building. I think it's back to front, isn't it? That's it. Yes, you can see that the building is somewhat different from it was back in the 1846 period. The next slide is of the Botanical Gardens fountain, and the artist's unknown. It was presented by a Mr. William Owen in 1861, so that puts it in its time frame. But the building in the background is interesting, and it's the Lunatic Asylum. It's a lovely name. The Lunatic Asylum was in fact on the corner of Hackney Road and Botanic Road, and it was the next slide shows you, if you can sort of picture that, we'll show you the next slide, which is the Yarrabee, which is the same corner where the Lunatic Asylum, and this is the only building left, which was the gatehouse to the Lunatic Asylum, and it's now Yarrabee, used by the Botanic Garden for I think, lectures and what have you, and training of apprentices for the Botanic Garden. Now the next slide shows you Adelaide as it is today. And you can, I don't know whether it's clear enough, probably not, but you can sort of see the massive area that the railways have taken out. The institutions along North Terrace have taken a lot of the parklands. You've got Adelaide Oval, you've certainly got the race course, you've got a lot of the Hackney bus depot, of course. You've got things down Port Road like the police barracks and the NWS works, so that there's a lot of areas that have been alienated over the period of time. Now let's have a look at some of the areas that have been alienated. First of all, the Railway Reserve. The next slide will show you, of course, the Adelaide Railway Station. And of course, since 1853, about 126 acres or 51 hectares have been alienated. In fact, the lack of planning for the introduction of the railways was in Light's original plan, was one of the few mistakes he made. It's interesting that he didn't anticipate the railways, although the railways had been founded for a number of years before he came across, or invented, but he didn't appreciate that they were going to have such an impact on transport of the future. So they weren't even allowed for in the Adelaide Parklands, and the actual railway reserves take up a significant amount of the original parklands. The institutions along North Terrace are other areas that were originally parklands. Let's move down, which I think is a beautiful terrace and can justify in some cases areas that are taken for particular purposes that Light may not have thought of. The library, of course, this was the original building, constructed in 1860, and certainly a heritage item. The next building is the museum, and this was built in sections over the period of time. That the west wing was opened in 1844, but it was virtually built in 3 different sections at 3 different times. The next slide shows us the South Australian Art Gallery, and the foundations of this were laid in 1899 after a donation of $25,000 by Sir Thomas Elder for the purchase of paintings. And of course they then had to have a suitable building in which to hang the paintings, and of course the area selected was part of the parklands. The next slide shows you the university. We're moving, of course, down North Terrace, and this is Bonython Hall. Again, a donation of £60,000 was given, this time by Sir Lavington Bonython, on the strict condition that the university build a hall, if you like, as the old traditional Oxford, Cambridge great halls, and that this be built to block Pulteney Street going right through to the river, so that the idea was that the university campus wouldn't be split, so that the donation had a very interesting tag attached to it to stop Pulteney Street going through. In hindsight, not a bad move, I would suggest. Another story demonstrates the way in which ad hoc decisions concerning the parklands have been made in the past, is the one concerning how the School of Mines, now the SAIT, was located on the corner of North Terrace and Frome Road. This is quite an interesting building, built of red brick in the tradition, the architectural tradition of the turn of the century, very Victorian in outlook. But the Brookman building was donated, of course, by Sir George Brookman. He donated £15,000. And at the opening there was a conversation between Sir Lavington Bonython, who was chairman of the School of Mines, and the Premier who opened it. And the conversation was recalled by Sir Lavington, who said, "It occurred to me that it would be wise to fix the site," this is the site of the building, "myself, and to say nothing to anybody. Accordingly, I announced the gift and supplemented it with the statement that the building would be established where it now stands. At the next meeting of the council, I reported the gift and the intended location of the building. Both were warmly approved. When the ceremony," this is the opening of the building, "was over, I, this is still Sir Lavington speaking, drove away with the Premier, Sir Frederick Holder, and I asked him, "What do you think of the site?" He replied, "Excellent. It would be impossible to get any better. But why do you ask?" Sir Lavington replied, "Because no one had given it to us," he said. The Premier's reply, you don't say so," exclaimed the Premier, and he laughed very heartily. Can you imagine, in Adelaide, a prime site on North Terrace and Frome Road being built on by no approvals at all, by a donator, a very important person in Adelaide, of course, but a donor who gave $25,000. The ad hoc decision making in terms of alienation of Parklands is quite unbelievable. The next slide not a very good one, but it shows the another area alienated, which is the Victoria Park Racecourse. Well, I often wonder, do you notice how in South Australia the horses run in an anti-clockwise direction? I think in Victoria they do the same, but in New South Wales and Queensland they run the other way. It must confuse the horses terribly. Horse racing was allocated Victoria Park Racecourse in 1847. This is rather early to have a sport, in fact, using the Parklands. But they were a very well organised lobby group, the racing fraternity, and they were supported from within the leading citizens of the state. In fact, Colonel Light himself was a cavalryman, and he fought in the Peninsular Wars with Wellington. And there is suspected that he might have, in fact, made preliminary sketches giving an area for horse racing in the Parklands, but we can't find that, or I can't anyhow. But it was established in a very central area, and you'll note that since the period that that's been going, there's been moves to fence it time and time again. But at least in Adelaide we have, I think, one of the only spots in the world where there's an unfenced major race course from a major city where people can in fact watch the races, and there's only a fairly small section that's allocated for enclosures and keeps the public out. Quite unusual, and the fights that went on to have it fenced, and the anti-fenced league, as it was called, did an excellent job to limit the amount of parklands that were actually alienated by racing, horse racing. Now the next slide shows a different sort of racing, and this is one of the Grand Prix circuit. I know there are some of you in the audience who have strong views on the Grand Prix, so I'm not going to comment any further on this, except that to say there's a lot of support for the maintaining and keeping of the Grand Prix. But one has to agree, it fences the parkland, alienates the parkland, and I think Colonel Light would turn in his grave. The next slide shows you the swimming in Adelaide. It's not right in order here. Let me just give you a bit of a briefing on it. Swimming was first undertaken in the River Torrens, and it was very dangerous because there were three particular spots where you had to be careful. One was the hole near Hackney Bridge, one was the Eureka at St Peter's, and the other was the Rock at Walkerville, and these were very deep holes that took the lives of people. But nevertheless, people swam in the river. But then in the 1860s, the city baths were in operation on Parklands, and some of you will recall where they were, near the Festival Theatre, on that site there. In 1969, there was a need to upgrade the swimming pool because swimming became a glamour sport. With Australians' dominance of the Olympic swimming in the 1950s, and particularly the 1956 Games, if you remember that, Games in Melbourne, Australia just wiped the world, if you like, with swimming. So all states upgraded their swimming pools, and everyone had to have an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So the King William Street site was needed for the Festival Theatre, and this gave the opportunity to move the swimming pool to North Adelaide. And this, in fact, is the site of the swimming pool before it was built, the area of the parklands without the swimming pool on it. The next slide shows you the actual swimming pool as it is built, and whilst some people are swimmers, it does alienate a very significant area of the parklands. Then in 1985, the pool was again upgraded because international standards had changed and they covered the pool, and it's now has a massive span of area, the largest of its type in the southern hemisphere, and it was built at the cost of $8.25 million to roof it. It's quite an accomplishment if you are interested in international standard swimming. If you are interested in parklands, you may have a different view of the swimming pool. I'm embarrassed because our department footed the bill. The next alienation of the parkland I'd like to show you is, of course, the Adelaide Oval. This site was given for the exclusive use of the South Australian Cricket Association in 1874 by Act of Parliament. Cricket was such a popular sport that little or no opposition was raised to it. You know, the first time W.G. Grace came out here, and people like Victor Richardson, and we've got the Bradmans and the Chappells in the modern ages. Cricket is almost a religion in South Australia and virtually in Australia. And in fact, as I said, there was very little opposition. The Mayor of Adelaide at the time was Sir Edwin Smith, and he was also a member of the Legislative Assembly, and he said, quote, he was disappointed that the association, that's the South Australian Cricket Association, did not seek more land. They had 12 acres and they were given another 3, or 15 acres was taken out of the parklands. Now, as I said before, this is a beautiful ground, and is, in fact, some people say the best cricket ground in the world. So the judgment has to be a balanced one, whether to sacrifice the parklands for a sport like cricket is an asset or a plus or a minus. All right, now, if we could just have the lights on again, we won't be looking at slides until toward the end. There's a few more to go. The book itself is divided into 4 sections. The first part describes the acquisition of the parklands, its origins and its historical theories, and I tried to get into Light's mind of how he planned the parklands, and I got to a few sources about what his background was, his ethos, where he lived in England and where he fought his wars and on the continent, to see whether he in fact had a parklands experience, and that was quite interesting to try and get into Light's mind. Then the second part of chapter, or part 1, deals with how the parklands were preserved under pressure, what Light's instructions were from the colonisation commissioners, the problems of Governor Gawler, who purchased the parklands and didn't pay for them. And in the end, the Adelaide City Council questions the purchase of the parklands in 1879 and 1880, and they employ an expensive London solicitor to check the legality of the original purchase of the parklands for £1 an acre, and they hoped that they could prove that it was illegal to actually purchase the parklands in the first place, and they would receive compensation and in fact the ownership of the parklands. But after a long legal discussion, their solicitors in London maintained that they didn't have a leg to stand on, fortunately perhaps. Part 2 concentrates on the way in which the government reserves were obtained, and this is a detailed breakdown of each reserve, and areas are mapped, and there's areas traced through from the times when they were originally taken, often by just a cabinet minute, often not even discussed in Parliament. Sometimes there's areas of the parklands which were allocated to government departments for storerooms and store sheds that just happened to stay there, and someone found out, oh gee, we better get around to legalising this, so they put through an executive council notice in the Gazette just saying that this area has been allocated to the public buildings department, what have you. Areas such as the stone quarry, I had to locate, the stone quarries, they had to be located. Where the Agricultural and Horticultural Society moved, it seemed to move around a bit. Then also, some of the interesting areas were on North Terrace, the Jubilee Exhibition Building. The exhibition was held in 1887-88, a year later than the 50 years of the colony, because they couldn't agree that they should have a ceremony. Then the Jubilee building was built on North Terrace. It's remained there for some time, but it was eventually, if you recall, pulled down, and the land carved up for the Napier building to be built at the university, and also for the Institute of Technology, or what was a School of Mine. So we lost a classic building, if you like, off North Terrace, and the area was carved up just simply for a car park, underground car park, and the Napier building. The Botanic Garden quest was an interesting one. There are 4 separate sites for the Botanic Garden originally. It gave me some headaches to try and plot where these sites were. Brian Morley, who's read the book from the Botanic Gardens, has pointed out, in fact, there were 5 sites, so I missed one somewhere along the line. And also the first hospital location was rather interesting. It was very, very vague, and particularly where the lunatic asylum and the hospital were joined together at one stage in terms of their management. Now, Part 3 describes the role of the Adelaide City Council as managers of the Parklands. This has produced some very interesting research, and I was able to spend some glorious hours, Saturday mornings mainly, in the basement of the town hall, going through all the old minute books and annual reports by myself, and I think that things have improved since then. You can't get access to them the way I did, but that was very interesting going through them. Also, that chapter, the Part 3, has a chapter on the way sporting groups were able to obtain leases. I've mentioned the cricket and the racing, and there are a number of others like the Lawn Tennis Association, the Memorial Drive tennis courts, etc., and the number of bowling clubs, the croquet clubs. All of these groups have got land that were parklands, and it was interesting to trace how they put pressure on the system to get pieces of land for their own exclusive use. Pressure groups, and particularly sporting groups, wield a most amazing power sometime, and it's a fascinating study to see how they lobby to be able to get exclusive use of areas of the parkland. Good group politics at work. The chapter, I think it's chapter 9, deals with what recreation means, and I found this the most satisfying to write because of my background in recreation and sport, I guess. It helped me to clarify what is meant by recreation, and also what is meant by leisure, and the way in which people last century used their leisure, and the Saturday afternoon sport developed because of the Saturday morning closing, or the 40-hour week, and etc. There's a whole history, if you like, of the way in which people have used their leisure time and how the parklands have had to cope with more usage from this source. Now, Part 4 is a completely new section that deals with initiatives taken in returning the areas of the parklands as a result of the Commissioner Tompkinson report, and also dealing with some of the management procedures that the Adelaide Plan threw up. Decisions on the future use of the bus depot and the reserves, including the Post-Tel Centre on West Terrace, which incidentally has been bought from the Commonwealth, as you probably know, and will be handed back to Parklands, I understand, within about 12 months, and there'll be nice, we hope, gardens right through on West Terrace. The Adelaide Jail, well, it closed yesterday or the day before, and that area has some difficulties, of course, deciding what you do with it. It's a very expensive operation to turn it into a historical museum, but nevertheless it's going to be returned to Parklands. There will be, I think, fairly soon some ideas in terms of landscaping the area around and making it a linear linkage, if you like, from Benithan Park right through to the Weir area itself. Also, in this section, there's a chapter on how the parklands could be managed in the future, either by Act of Parliament or a statutory body, or strengthening the Adelaide Planning Commission powers on the parkland management. Any of those ideas, of course, the Adelaide City Council are very defensive about, and rightly so, because it would take the management of the parklands out of their hands. A bold suggestion is made in the book that perhaps we should link the Adelaide parklands with the second generation parklands. Light encircled Adelaide, which is quite unique in the world. We have in Adelaide one of the most unique sites in the world in terms of the city development of its open space. We don't quite realise that. Now, there are some moves to have another belt of parklands, if you like, an outer belt, metropolitan belt of parklands. Now, the idea is maybe you should link both of those with legislation and an Act of Parliament so that no one can alienate them in the future, and you link both of those belts of parklands together. There are also very extensive references in the book because I felt that really, I hope that a lot of other people will now follow through and chase up texts and what have you. Other researchers maybe use this as a base document, and that it gives details of the government dockets, if you like, so that sometime in the future people may be able to go to those and follow them through, get through the bureaucracy. There are 36 maps and plans have been provided, and they build up a picture of how the alienation has progressed over time. The maps themselves have been very well done by the Lands Department, and I must congratulate them on the work and the time they spent on those maps. One interesting map, though, deals with the area calculation for the roads through the parklands that have been cut through the parklands over the years. Colonel Light had something like 16 or 17 roads that ran from the parklands to the outer, what were then nothing, of course, but ended up being suburbs. Hugh Stretton was very keen to find out how over the years the roads have been widened, additional roads put in, corners have been rounded off, and bits of parklands now and again get nicked away, and how they would add up over time. And we could then calculate, if you like, the areas or the acreage of road that's been alienated over time. Well, this was another interesting exercise, but it's pretty tricky to try and work out the widths and the areas of roads and do it. Nevertheless, there's a cute little implement that the Lands Department has, a computer that actually you run over them and it calculates all that for you, so that made it easier. So what we did, we took 3 time spans. We did the roads in 1837, 1937, which was the 100-year centenary, and cars, if you recall, were just sort of starting to become popular, so there was stress on the engineers to design roads and widen the original bully tracks and what have you through the parklands. And we took the latest Adelaide Parklands maps and what have you where the roads are, and we calculated the way in which over those period of time the acreage has been alienated. The results are interesting. It's not surprising that, of course, the difference with Light and 1937 was pretty remarkable, but the interesting thing is there are 2 hectares less roads now than there were in 1937, which is very unusual. I almost had to go back and do it all again because it destroyed my theories. But the reason, of course, is that there's been a number of road closures, like the Beaumont Road recently, but there's been quite a few others. And although others have been widened, the actual number of roads closed since 1937 has compensated. So in fact, the Stretton/Daly theory of more alienation from 1937 till now doesn't hold. I like to say that, or like to comment, if you like, on George Kingston, who was the assistant surveyor. I like what he had to say. He was also assistant surveyor to Light, and he ended up being Sir George, of course, who was the Speaker in the House of Assembly. And he said, "A detailed history of some of the encroachments on the parklands would be amusing, showing from how small beginnings at the insignificant hut of the squatter, by adding a piece here and squaring a corner there, has gradually grown into a building of respectable proportions." And that's true. That's the way in which alienation occurs. You add a bit here and you put a bit onto a building there. Now, let me just quickly go through some of the highs and lows of writing this thing. One is, if you like, a high, was that I was going through the records of how Light originally planned the parklands. Back in England, he must have had access to documents, and I was going through in the Bar Smith Library some microfilm, and I came across a parliamentary paper in 1833 by a select committee of the House of Commons dealing with public walks. And it was probably known to Colonel Light, and it emphasises the values of parks and recreation in planning cities. The term recreation was used back in that time. Everyone thinks it's a fairly modern term. It isn't. One descriptive quote, if you like, from that document, which is a House of Commons document, says, and I love the wording of it, I quote, Your committee feel convinced that some open spaces reserved for the amusement, brackets, under due regulation to preserve order, close brackets, of the humbler classes would assist to wean them from low and debasing pleasures. Great complaint is made of drinking houses, dog fights and boxing matches, yet unless some opportunity for other recreation is afforded to working men, they are driven to such pursuits. The spring to industry, which occasional recreation gives, seems quite necessary to the poor as to the rich. Very interesting statement. To find those things when you're doing research, as those of you who have done that, lift the spirits, if you like, and it makes all the boring, repetitive chasing of information worthwhile. Let me say some of the lows, or give you an example of a low. That was a high. This is a low. Of course, the rejections from publishers can be lows too. But one of the worst lows was to the complete rewrite of the chapter on the council as managers of the Parklands. I'd spent months going through every annual report of the Adelaide City Council in that basement, dusty basement, and the financial statements, and the task was to identify the income and expenditure on the Parklands over a period of time to see in fact what the council had spent on the Parklands. And in fact over the period of time, the first few years of the council, they were absolutely financially embarrassed, and they let areas of the Parklands out for financial gain, and they made profits out of the Parklands in a big way. They let sand leases out, the rubbish tips were let out, they even chopped trees down and sold the dead wood. Those sorts of things brought income in, and they spent very little on parkland. They were cow paddocks, let's face it. We got all this information together, and it just didn't fit into the book. And it really, I've got mountains of this stuff at home, which are no use. So it was virtually 5 or 6 months' work that will just stay where it is until I hope someone else might like to take it up. So there are the lows. Some of the good features of the Parklands, you all know. Attractive, well-kept park areas, the beauty of the gardens, the well-manicured green golf courses, the gentle river torrents, and the provision of wide range of sporting facilities. We're proud of these, and they are a tourist attraction. And you only have to go through the Parklands during weekends to see how Adelaideans and interstate people remark about the way the Parklands are used. Now, I don't have to show you slides of all this, it's not a tourist night tonight, but I'll now show you some of the bad features of the Parklands, and let's have a look at some of the slides of the less pleasant features, if you like, of some of our proud Parklands. The first one is, of course, the result of the Grand Prix. I don't want to keep mentioning this, but this path miraculously appeared, no notice given, a new path that was cut in the East Terrace area, and you can see the Adelaide City Council were not kind of good with their trees. They hacked the tree as well. The path itself, walking trail or even a cycle track, it's now obviously been put in so that they can get service trucks in to areas for the Grand Prix. Now the next slide is the notice that appears on the Adelaide High School side. Authority to use these sports facilities must be obtained from the Bursar. Wrong. They are public parklands. That notice itself is almost illegal and an insult to people, and they ought to be able to use those parklands. They are free, they belong to the people, and that is a notice that I think the Parklands Preservation Association would like to sneak out one night and dismantle. The next slide, not a good one, but this is the Postel Recreation Centre on West Terrace. It's a tin shed. The courts themselves have now deteriorated. It was owned, of course, by the Commonwealth Government when they took over postal and telecommunications in the early part of the century. It was telegraph, I guess, and they've owned it ever since. Now, they have since sold that back to the Adelaide City Council. The negotiations were interesting. They set a price on that at commercial value, city values, which was astronomical, thinking that well, that's the sort of basis if someone bought it, they could build a building on it. Well, there'd be no way you could put a building on that. Even the Adelaide City Council wouldn't have approved that. So I think what's happened is that now that's been bought, my concern is that it may not go back to Parklands because there are sporting groups who are angling to use it. The Adelaide High School put in a bid for it as a gymnasium area. That's now not going ahead, but they're building a gymnasium onto the Adelaide High School, which is going to alienate some proportion of the parkland if they get the approval to go ahead. The concern in my mind is that that is on one of the gateways to the city, the West Terrace, and to me that ought to be returned to gardens, as is the plan for the from the Parks and Recreation Department of the Adelaide City Council. When it happens, I don't know. It does now belong to the Adelaide City Council, and I hope that that will occur, because it is really a blot on an area where people do come into the city and see that sort of thing in the parklands is not conducive to tourism, I wouldn't think. This is an area of parklands, believe it or not. It's near the Morford Street Bridge. One of the big arguments is, what do you do with cars? There's car parking and hard surfaces in the parkland. Now, I admit you've got to have somewhere to park cars, but if we're going to park cars, be a little bit creative. Not just put little tin things like that there, or not tin, but just a shed there. No design, no landscaping. The whole area itself is just a complete mess, and it seems to me that if they're parklands, they ought to be carefully looked at in terms of their usage. They are public areas after all. The next slide. This is the Adelaide Bowling Club in Hutt Street. Again, I know fairly well that area. That's an artificial grass surface that was put down as an experimental strip for bowls. It never worked. They tried bowls on it as well, and it was simply just not workable. The only use that that is now is for the hockey members to hit balls around just to try out the surface before we get a new hockey stadium out at Jeff's Cross, because hockey has become a game that's played on artificial surface. To my mind, that ought to be ripped up and either planted in grass or else returned to parklands. It served its purpose, it failed, we ought to just return it to parklands. The next slide shows the marvellous Hyatt building on the station area, overlooking the parklands or overshadowing the parklands. The miraculous thing is, why the hell did anyone allow them to build it? Except, of course, that we got some interesting contracts from overseas, I guess. And the final slide is the rubbish dump, if you like. The Adelaide City Council called it a store yard. I don't quite agree. This is on West Terrace, believe it or not, just behind the high school. Wouldn't that area be marvellous if it was landscaped and returned to just unstructured public use? It seems to me that in this day and age, in a city the size of Adelaide, we don't need to have a, in brackets, store shed of that sort in the parklands. It's up to all of us who are committed to retaining the parklands to act as watchdogs over Adelaide's most priceless asset. Decisions can easily become disasters.